Okay.
Where did we post it?
We're now
Or chat?
recording. So everyone has to act professional now.
And that's not allowed.
Okay, so today's dev session is primarily around ADR 45 and on the subject of evidence handling within Tendermint. So has anyone, would anyone like to start the conversations?
Well, so yeah, we have this, okay, so the state of things right now, I guess there's a few things. One is we understand that evidence handling is insufficient for a variety of reasons. It's not clear that these are all sufficiently well documented. There's the one issue about counterfactual slashing that, is from many moons ago that sparked all the like client research over the summer, which has come a long way, progressed quite substantially. One conclusion from that is actually counterfactual slashing isn't quite what we're looking for. We're really interested in invalid state. So it's not so much, the idea with counterfactual slashing was that we found that there are attacks on the skipping like client, so like the skipping bisection like client, where validators who are no longer in the validator set but were in the validator set recently, like within the unbonding period, can sign, bad blocks that will convince a like client that, they're still in the validator set or whatever. But it turns out it's worse than that because the attack still works even for validators that are still in the validator set. And they can still mount this kind of attack without double signing. And so more importantly than say slashing people for, for signing when they're not in the validator set is catching validators who were recently bonded within the unbonding period who are signing invalid blocks. And I think in our attack categorization, we call these lunatic validators. Is that right, Zarko? Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. So one thing we have to deal with is evidence for the lunatic scenario. And one, I guess, somewhat open question about that, which actually came up while I was reviewing a somewhat orthogonal evidence-related issue yesterday, is specifically what kind of invalid blocks we're worried about. And so far, the focus has been pretty much exclusively on signing blocks with incorrect validator sets, because I think we have assumed that that's kind of sufficient to capture the kind of misbehavior we're worried about. But I think we need to also understand if we need to worry about other kinds of invalid data in the header. For instance, application like app hashes and potentially other things as well. So that's one thing, is dealing with evidence for the lunatic validator scenario and actually properly understanding from details of like the particulars of the Tendermint header what constitutes a lunatic attack or lunatic evidence that we want to punish for, and if it's just for validator set hashes or if it's for signing anything invalid in the header. So
Can you say one more time what the lunatic validator scenario is?
The lunatic validator scenario is when you have a validator who was recently in the validator set, like within the unbonding period. And sorry, someone's typing. And,
sorry. I was trying to write this down. I'll mute myself.
Okay. So someone who was recently in the validator set, so within the unbonding period, and may or may not still be in the validator set, who then signs a block, who signs an invalid block, basically a block header that has hashes that are not outputs from the legitimate state transition function. So they have an incorrect validator set or an incorrect app hash or whatever the case may be. And that can be used to trick a like client using the bisection / skipping verification. The like client can be tricked to jump ahead, thinking this validator is still in the validator set or controls more of the validator set than they actually do, and then starts believing whatever they see from him. And so that kind of behavior needs to be punishable. there's a big open issue on Tendermint about, counterfactual slashing, which was how this was originally discovered, specifically in the example where the validator is no longer part of the validator set. That was kind of the easiest to think about. So they used to be part of the validator set. Now they're no longer part of the validator set. But a light client doesn't know that, and they get tricked to think this guy is still part of the validator set, and that's bad news. But we also discovered that the attack even works even if they're still part of the validator set. So the kind of counterfactual thing, is irrelevant. Even if they're still part of the validator set, but they sign a conflicting, they sign a block that still has invalid state. Or whatever, so they can still mount the attack whether or not they're part of the validator set. And so just, initially the thinking was like, oh, we have to slash validators if they sign blocks when they're not part of the validator set. And that's actually not enough. And that will probably cover cases that we don't care about. Like, surely there are ways to sign blocks when you're not part of the validator set that, can't be used to attack light clients. So more specifically, what we're worried about are validators within the unbonding period who are signing invalid blocks, so blocks with incorrect hashes, and that's more specifically what can be used to attack light clients.
One comment here, or it's kind of more a question. If we consider only light client attacks, then we know what is a canonical chain. So for every height, we know what is the right header. So we know what is the right value of validator set hash and application hash. Mm-hmm. So anything which is any sort of commit which signs something different is essentially example of lunatic attack.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so, so in this case, it seems that the requirement could be that, or what qualifies for this lunatic attack is just that there is a difference between something from kind of evidence corresponds to what we have on the main chain.
Yeah.
So if you talk in general about attacks on the main chain, then maybe it's slightly more tricky, because then you need also to see if you have two blocks, which one is valid or not. So you really need to have application, and you need to look at the block and execute transaction to see whether transition is valid or not. Mm-hmm. But if you talk about just the light client attacks, maybe then it's a bit simpler, because you just need to look at what is canonical header and just do the simple comparison. Mm-hmm. And everything which is outside. So if you are signing and you're not in validator set, or if you are signing for a different application hash, then it's sort of evidence of misbehavior. So you can be slashed for that.
Yeah. I think we should just focus on the light client attacks, just to keep this somewhat scoped, and also because we can't necessarily punish the full node attacks, because if there is one, it means more than a third are malicious, and then they can censor evidence. So we have to drop to social consensus anyway. So any other questions on this kind of lunatic attack, or why it's important, or why we need to deal with it, or what some of the uncertainties around it might be?
And I would just complement here that if you want to picture a like more high level how this would work, if a light client detect or find two conflicting headers, you can submit this as an evidence. And then the first thing we are doing when we do this evidence handling is we first check for lunatic attack, because this is kind of relatively simple. We don't need challenge response protocol for this. It's just looking at what is the canonical value of the header, what is the difference, and then the guys who are misbehaving can be immediately slashed. And then if this is not the case, then we need to do more. Somehow we need to do more, and then we need to enter this challenge response thing. Although now I'm thinking I'm kind of. I'm wondering if, this with this lunatic case, like, are we also, covering potentially some of those also other attacks?
No, because the lunatic, most of the other attacks are actually valid blocks. They're just attacks on the underlying consensus algorithm. But the lunatic is like an invalid state transition.
Oh. So it's really like, so it's really like you try lunatic, because it's simpler, and then for everything else, we need to do the full challenge response protocol.
Yeah. Yeah. But okay, so that's one thing, is dealing with the lunatic style of evidence. And that will address the whole like counterfactual thing. I think really that counterfactual issue has grown a bit large. There's large discussion there. Everyone's understood that there's a problem. We need to bust up that issue into like smaller, more actionable items. So hopefully, a follow-up from this call will be a path forward on doing that. So, one thing will be addressing, lunatic attack. But so another important concern is the nature of the evidence, kind of the structure of the evidence submitted by a light client. So for instance, right now, the way we handle evidence within the Tendermint consensus is on a single vote basis, right? So someone detects in real time that a validator double signed, and they have two votes from the same validator that have conflicting block IDs, and they broadcast a single piece of evidence that contains those two votes, and everyone says, yes, you have two votes here, it's easy to check. This guy's bad news. But with a light client doesn't see conflicting votes from a single validator. It sees conflicting commits. So full commits, with plus 2/3 votes from the validator set, where at least 1/3 is double signing. And so the structure of the evidence that it's submitting, unless we force it to do a bunch more work, so that's kind of the question now, is when the light client detects two conflicting commits, and it has two batches of signatures that are signing for different block IDs. What should it submit, right? Should it just submit those commits in full? So we have a piece of evidence that is two full commits. That's a lot of data. Potentially it'll start to open denial of service vectors against full nodes. It's like, if any light client could just submit all this crap and force full nodes to start checking a bunch of signatures, that could be bad and expensive. Regardless, even if we have a reduced version, they're going to have to submit, not just one or two signatures, but many. And I guess in the case of the hub, it'll be something like 12 signatures or something like that, right? Because 6 validators control a third. So if you have a third double signing, it could be like 12, but at a minimum. But it could also be way more depending on the composition of who's double signing. And so if the light clients are submitting these like large batches of signatures to full nodes, there needs to be, something that is going to protect the full nodes from just being bombarded by malicious light clients that are just trying to mess with them. And so maybe this is outside the scope of our concern. Maybe this is, there needs to be some kind of established relationship between light clients and full nodes that, is either metered or rate limited or authenticated by, some other means. And then it's not really our problem, which is maybe for the sake of scoping, for now, we assume that. But then it's a question of what does the light client actually submit? And so the simplest thing is to just submit the two conflicting commits that it found. But we could also have it do more work to actually look for what are the, who are the plus 1/3 validators that actually double signed here and submit that. Yeah,
but this is kind of tricky, and I think that apart from equivocation, light client cannot detect.
Exactly.
It can falsely accuse someone. So I think that the best we can do at a light client is just take these two conflicting commits, and it seems that we also need to have validator sets, then, because how we can know that someone voted for a different value just by seeing or we see a signature, but do we know from the vote itself? What is the public key of the validator?
We know the address. The address is in the vote.
It's part of the vote. Okay, because there was some discussion whether it should be there or not.
There was a lot of discussion, so that's that point keeps coming up, and I think everything is possible without the address in the vote. I haven't seen a really convincing thing that says, we definitely need it or we definitely don't, but it seems repeatedly to bring a lot of convenience to leave the address in the commit.
This is one of the examples where we really need to know the address. in case.
You would have the validator set one way or another. You could fetch the validator set, for instance, but the ADR for the commit reduction actually leaves the address in the commit so that we don't have to worry about these kinds of things, and the address is always available.
But imagine the case, you as a light client, you talk with two different full nodes. One is correct, the other is faulty. And faulty gives you a header. And header is signed by the set of faulty nodes. There is a different validator set in place. And now you see that there are two conflicting headers, you have signatures, and now you want to submit this. And you will submit it through the correct node. This correct node does not know this validator set, the faulty validator set.
Yeah, you would have to submit the validators along with it.
To do it. So you need to ask this, you need to get this from...
I guess actually you need it anyway because you need the voting powers. The voting powers aren't in the commit.
Okay, this is one more one.
Yeah.
But true.
Mm-hmm.
So really to have a meaningful evidence, which can be checked, we need this
In the future, like once we do come to the point where we start doing like signature aggregation and stuff like that, and the commit just basically becomes just the signature, like how would that affect the current scenario?
In signature aggregation, you'd have a bit array of who signed, and so then you would no longer have the addresses in the commit. But all of this is making me wonder how valuable having the addresses in the commit really are. Every time I think about it, I kind of oscillate. So, I don't know. Maybe it's worth it to just leave them for now, because in 6 months or a year we'll have signature aggregation or something. But
I mean, they're for sure staying for the foreseeable future.
Sure.
We can just try to see what is the simplest thing to do right now. And what are really pieces we need to be able to do this.
And but the other thing is, if the commits are from different validator sets, the light client could try to do more work to the light client could try to fill in the gap, right? And it could try to do, like, if there's different validator sets, it means one of them is from an invalid state transition. And the light client, in like the worst case, could fall back to sequential to find out which one is actually the invalid one, unless there's a fork on the main chain, and then it won't know. But assuming there isn't, then it would know which one is actually wrong. So that's the kinds of decisions we're starting to get into are like basically questions around how much work the light client can or should be expected to do before submitting versus how much we can just put on the full node. And the simplest thing for the light client is you detect a conflict, you submit it to the full node right away with everything you have, and you just call it there.
Yeah. I think this seems like the simpler approach just to start with. So we have a minimal complexity at a light client. We just detect, we package something with like evidence which can be verified, and then you submit it. And then full node can maybe full node has a more context. And so full node can maybe then do something before submitting really evidence to the main chain. But I would prefer that we don't over optimize, but just have something first really working end to end. And then we'll see where are the bottlenecks and where we can optimize. So we don't over optimize before.
Fair enough. So I guess then it's a question. So if the light client just detects it, pushes it to a full node, that means full nodes need to be willing to accept two commits in a single endpoint from a light client, which is heavy as mentioned. But let's put the denial of service issue to the side, and then the full node needs to take these things and now figure out what to do with it, right? So the full node will know right away by doing a simple lookup whether one of these things is invalid, in which case every single validator who signed on the invalid block is a lunatic, and we can send evidence of that. We can send that to the app very easily and say, okay, all these guys need to be slashed. So that's nice. If it's not the case, and instead we find that both blocks are actually valid from a state transition perspective, but are, there's a safety violation from consensus, like agreement violation, then the full node has to go into like the fork accountability mode. So then either it finds out it's pure equivocation or it's not. And there's more at play.
What if the full node is misbehaving here and submits the wrong evidence? Like submits the evidence for the right commit. Can that happen?
No, because everyone is going to. Okay. So we don't have to deal with the denial of service problem between the light node and the full node, but the full node is going to have to gossip this stuff to everyone else so that it eventually gets into a block. And there we do have a potential denial of service issue, because now full nodes are asking everyone to verify things and potentially do a lot of work before finding out that something is bad. So probably there should be an expectation, probably the light client needs to submit the data to a bunch of full nodes, at least one of whom is expected to be correct. We make that assumption anyway. And then each of them is, the one that's correct, presumably will do the work to, I guess, figure out the minimum amount of information it needs to gossip. It needs to gossip to others. And so if it's, so maybe for the lunatic validator scenario, it happens as individual signatures. So maybe we have a type of evidence that's just a single vote and a header. And all you have to do is check that the vote is for that header and that the header is the wrong header for the given height. And then, so if you have a bunch of lunatic validators in a block, the full node will break those up into individual pieces of evidence and gossip them, individually to all of its other full nodes and to all of its other peers, and those will check. And if any one of them is wrong, and it can check them one at a time, then the full node is bad, but all the others are legit, right?
So right now, evidence implementation of evidence reactor gossip protocol, like in mempool.
Yeah.
This probably would need to be changed for this, because
why?
Because the size of the evidence is it's 2 commits, and so if you just keep pushing around without.
No, but that's what I'm saying is that, so the light client might submit 2 commits to the full node, but the full node probably should not be submitting 2 commits to everyone else. So the full node should probably be the full node's going to so as soon as a correct full node receives these 2 commits, it should figure out how to bust it up into a set of individual small pieces of evidence, each of which can be checked kind of independently. And this is possible for lunatics and it's possible for equivocation, but when it comes to amnesia, all hell breaks loose, right? So if there are lunatic validators in there, it's easy to come up with small pieces that show that a single validator committed a lunatic violation, right? That they signed a header that's not the right header for a given height. You broadcast that single small piece of evidence to all your peers. They all check it, and verify it, and then it's just like the mempool, just like the current evidence. And same with equivocation. So basically, the full node needs to look at these 2 commits, look for lunatics. Okay, if it's lunatic, it takes the bad one, breaks it up into individual pieces, and sends all the lunatic votes to everyone else. And then if it's not lunatic, then it needs to figure out if there's equivocation. If there's equivocation, it can do the same thing, break it up into individual pieces, 1 piece of evidence for each validator that equivocated, send those to everyone. That's easy. And then if it's not equivocation and it's amnesia, then I don't know what happens. But we have to, then we have to drop into some kind of fork accountability protocol, and then, everything gets
this we'll discuss on Friday with Chris and then with everyone else after. But it seems that what we need in that case is that this evidence, like the full evidence, is pushed to the chain, which means that we will need to broadcast this using evidence reactor, and then commit it on the chain and then enter the whole even more complex thing after. But that's why I think that like if we are going anyway in this direction and have this environment, we could maybe already try to think about more clever glossy protocol and then use it even for kind of small evidences or more complex one.
Yeah, I mean, we can, so with getting everything onto the chain, I mean, someone could try to package it as a transaction. So this is where the, Tendermint versus the app stuff happens, right? So someone could take the two commits, pack it as a, do the work ahead of time to see that there's a conflict, pack it as a transaction, and send it to the app. And then Tendermint will just treat it like it's a very large transaction in the mempool. And at least that way it gets into the chain and we don't really have to worry about some other thing. But then we have to somehow have noticed that, this was a...
But what is the difference? In that case, you're not disseminating it using evidence reactor, or you push it to the mempool reactor. It's exactly the same thing.
Uh-huh. The difference is that it engages the applications like fee mechanics and the alleged currently non-existing, but one day to exist future, in the future, fee mechanics of the mempool.
Okay.
But, that means there has to be economics around who submits this thing, and they have to pay fees for it and get rewarded if it's valid, and, this kind of mess. Alternatively, we just we gossip it at some kind of evidence layer, but then we have a lot of concerns around denial of service there. Yeah.
What is the risk of ignoring this denial of service attack for evidence in a sort of first version of this?
Well, let's see. It means anyone can come around and send you a big chunk of so say we do the most naive thing is we just send a blob of 2 commits, as one big message. And so you send it out to everyone, evidence is presumably going to have high priority. So that's going to, it might slow everything else down, whatever. Then everyone receives this thing. And now they spend time verifying these signatures. And signature verification is expensive, and so they do all that and then they disconnect from you because they find out it's invalid. Something's invalid about it. They wasted a bunch of time. They disconnect from you, and then you reconnect and do it again. So it's unclear exactly. Presumably, if the node has enough resources, it'll just slow it down significantly. Yeah,
this is pretty bad.
Yeah, this seems like something we should think more about before implementing, because someone can just bombard, panic the entire network.
Mm-hmm.
Someone could just DOS quite easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember in September we briefly discussed the evidence reactor being absorbed into the mempool reactor. Is that still on the table, or are we still thinking of keeping it as it is?
No, it's on the table, but it requires a bunch of upfront design work to accommodate the priority structuring, but it also doesn't necessarily address this problem. Well, does it? How would it address this problem?
I mean, if for Tendermint 2020, something that we put down there is lifting the mempool into the application in a way, so the application handles much of the mempool logic other than gossiping, of course.
Anyway, it seems like somehow the same. You're just doing the verification, but in terms of system resources, you are wasting resources anyway. So it seems the only meaningful way to prevent this is to have a cost associated with doing this, or doing it very cheap, very efficiently. But we don't know how to verify signature in a cheap way.
Well, there are batch verification techniques, and so I don't know how much that actually amortizes the cost.
This is something that Oasis Labs is doing with their library. for ET2519 signatures
Uh-huh.
that we, or Zaki brought up about testing it on the hub for fast sync.
I think Greg is actually testing it this week on the hub. So that's cool.
So is this aggregate signature or it's something that?
No, it's just batch verification of, it's just a more efficient verification method that I think, I don't know how much it reduces the overhead. I've heard figures like 2x or something, but I don't know if 2x is enough if we're talking about tens of signatures potentially.
Yeah. I mean, with BLS or this kind of scheme, then we talk about 2 signatures. So then,
then the problem goes away.
Don't have a problem. But even in that case, we might want still to associate some cost. This would be sort of probably the right way to do it. The question is how.
A BLS signature is about 10 times slower than an ED25519 signature. Just so like really BLS signatures only start to really make sense when you get into the many hundreds of validators.
It's 10 times slower to verify.
Yeah.
And is that that's like a theoretical bound, or is that something that could, as software matures?
No, it's just because
it's like more multiplications or something.
No, it's just the field is huge. Like the GT is huge. And so, we have to, we don't know what the upper limit of how fast you can make this on like real computers, but we do not build computers with, 1,000-bit registers.
Yeah. Right. So regardless, we still have this issue, which is why kind of initially I was saying, oh, well, maybe we force this into a transaction because then at least there's some economic consideration, at least in theory, for the thing to get gossiped. And I guess, maybe Marko, that's related to like collapsing evidence into the mempool somehow. I don't know if there's, other ways. Unless the fork accountability protocol starts at the peer-to-peer layer, and the and basically a peer, the full node who gets these conflicting commits can somehow initiate the protocol to start like gossiping smaller pieces of relevant information, so people can start accumulating like some semblance of evidence for what's going on. I mean, that might be really complicated. It might net out to be way more overhead and bandwidth actually used, but it might somehow, if it's even possible to design it, mitigate the like upfront denial of service issue.
On the P2P layer, I think that's in the current implementation of the P2P layer that might open up a can of worms. And at least on the P2P layer, I'd feel more comfortable if we sat down and did like a spec and implementation path towards a kind of new P2P layer and took all these things into consideration instead of like kind of putting band-aids on band-aids.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's orthogonal from the like P2P design and so on. I mean, we know the current P2P system is like sufficient to support these complex reactor protocols like consensus and whatever. Obviously, there's a lot wanting, and we want to upgrade it, but yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure we have to like, revamp the whole peer system just to get this protocol in there, but it's a question of, is it even really possible to design that protocol? Yeah. And so, like actually there's an issue that's been open for a long time that Zarko, you and I have gone back and forth on. I don't know that we ever really like resolved it, where the issue was about putting the hash of the polka in your pre-commit, so that when you pre-commit, you actually are committing to the hash of the polka that justified it, right? And potentially having something like that could make designing a peer-to-peer protocol for fork accountability more tractable, because then it's about like, can you gather enough, it kind of turns the signature verification problem into like a hash verification problem, by basically for each vote in the commit, can you compose the polka, like can you find the polka that justified it, kind of thing. Obviously it's more complex than just stating that, but and that might be something that's a little more tractable at the peer layer without having to like first get everything on chain or whatever. So that's another question. Basically, like, the design space here is kind of large, right? So just to kind of reiterate the set of options. So one thing is, okay, so we've essentially restate the problem. We have this huge chunk of data, which is 2 conflicting commits, which is, large.
So can you just repeat, how big is this, like in the worst case, in terms of really like, is it megabyte or like?
No, it's like kilobytes, I think. So a commit is I think around 100 bytes or something, or sorry, a vote, like a signature in the new commit, it's basically a signature and an address and a timestamp. So, ballpark 100 bytes. And say you have, I don't know, 70 of them, or let's just say 100 of them, whatever. So, that's 10 kilobytes per commit. So 20 kilobytes.
So is like 20 kilobytes a lot in our case? Like,
no, but the problem isn't the bulk size of the data. The problem is that there's 200 signatures in there that you're expected to verify, right? Yeah. Okay. So it's not so much, the issue isn't so much the bandwidth as the CPU time, I think. But so that's another question. If you can, so we can kind of separate the denial of service issues here, I guess. Like one is the bandwidth, and okay, so having a node try to dump 20 kilobytes on you, not that big a deal, right? The network should be able to handle that. But then do you have like dedicated CPU resources, say, to go and check 200 signatures to find out if it's even legitimate, right? And if, and maybe at the end of the day, like that's not that bad. The problem is this is supposed to be a high priority thing. So it's kind of like, oh shit, you saw this like conflicting commits. You're kind of supposed to drop everything and check that this is good. But, in the off chance that it's not good, you don't really want to drop everything. So maybe it can happen kind of in the background. But then we have to kind of, ensure that there's enough resources for everything else to keep moving smoothly forward. So I don't know, it'd be nice if we had a better way to kind of measure the impact on like resource consumption of this stuff, and had a more like formal framework for reasoning about what is acceptable, rather than this just like heuristic, like, oh, having to verify 100 signatures is bad,
Exactly. That's why I'm wondering, like, if we have some numbers, just do the, we see how this is like embarrassingly parallel task. Like, do this really in parallel. So, like, if we take average hardware, which is used maybe on Cosmos Hub as an example, and just see how fast we can do this thing, then we have a bit better idea what is really impact on the normal operation if we do this thing in, let's say, as a background task. Mm-hmm. And then this could maybe help us more see what we need to optimize for, just that we don't enter again, because it's, as I say, it's like very complex and the space is huge. So that just we are not solving the right problem. Just there's this risk there. But sorry, I interrupted you. Like,
no, I think that's spot on.
But if we ignore this for a time being, like, what we can figure out right now, what is design space if we assume that we can handle this as a background task?
Oh, if we can handle it, then the guy who gets it from the light client sends it to everyone. Everyone checks it. If it's bad, they reject him and just assume that's part of the bad peer management. If it's good, they send it to everyone else. Eventually, this huge piece of evidence gets included in a block. Sorry, it just struck me that I think we might have bounds on how much of a block evidence can take up, which we would need to change. But I think there's actually an issue in the milestone for that anyway. So it would get included in a block, and then that's supposed to somehow kickstart a fork accountability process, right?
if we can do this, like if what you said up to now is true, and we can do this with a, let's say, reasonable increase of attack surface, then what follows can be like a relatively straightforward, in a sense that we can deal with this everything as part of the evidence handling. And so we don't need all these special cases, and we don't need to push this logic to the GOSSI protocol and figure out, chunk the evidence into parts and submit the smaller pieces, etc. We can just then push it there, and then you take these two evidences and you do all the check, and you just punish the bad guys. So this would be the benefit of this approach, that it would be like probably simpler to implement and get right in the first version. So so I think at least it's sort of worth maybe trying to see what is to measure the cost of what this would have, because conceptually I think it has a benefit compared to other approaches where we need to really think
simpler,
about it.
Measure it somehow. Yeah. But then, okay, so then, then it gets submitted in a block, and then what's supposed to happen?
Now, what happens in that case that there is this evidence handling logic. It seems I was assuming that this is happening as part of application space. That you have the module which is able to, for example, Cosmos SDK, where you receive these two evidences, and then you need to start this challenge response protocol. So first you do this check, you check for lunatic case or these simple cases, and then if you talk about this most complex one, amnesia or going back to the past, then for this you need to first mark all validator set which are as suspected, like the current one, which are part of the attack somehow. And in this case, they are expected to submit their vote sets for this height. And it seems that we can be kind of slightly more clever there, because it's again a lot of data. It's even more data then, which needs to be committed on the chain as part of this protocol again, as some sort of probably transaction. In this case, we can do a sort of two-step protocol, where in the first step, you only send your signatures, only the messages you signed. And then in the second step, you send the messages from, let's say, faulty guys, the one you saw and which are not really pop up as a part of first step, because the faulty guy is trying to hide. And once this is over, then we have all data that we need, and then it's just a matter of running this function, which go through every validator set, and just it can identify all kinds of faulty behavior, deterministic kind. So somehow the complexity there is collecting these vote sets. And if we can do this thing as a kind of two-step, it seems that the complexity wouldn't be too high. I mean, complexity measure in terms of bytes.
So, okay, a few things struck me about this. So just first of all, it occurs to me that our formulation of like the unbonding period as the sum of a set of latencies actually needs to account for this additional latency of collecting votes, which in the past it hadn't. It was just how long it takes to submit the evidence. But not only do you have to submit the evidence, you also need enough time to collect vote sets from everyone. So, so that's fun. So that's one. Another is do we think all of this should happen at the application layer? I mean, because this is something that's going to be generic to, this is generic to Tendermint, and every application is going to need this. And so in theory, it does need to be committed, but actually all the logic can be handled Tendermint side. And, part of like submitting evidence or something, we can have a part of the block that's like justification, where you get your votes or whatever included in, you get your justifications included in proposed blocks as, separate piece of the block that Tendermint can then check.
Yeah, I think this is kind of now the interesting part, like what are the trade-offs in terms of having this logic defined at the Tendermint versus application level? And I think this is like probably something we can discuss now, because I think no matter how we deal with the discuss of evidence, anything, we need to make this decision sooner than later. Like at what level? And it's true that this is something which is for all Tendermint-based application, they can rely on this. There is nothing particular about Cosmos here. So it's about validator sets and checking essentially signatures.
Yeah.
And we anyway have a trust relationship between Tendermint and application, and so there would be nothing would change there.
No, nothing would change.
There was Marko. You remember what were the reasons for advocating doing this as part of the application layer?
So I've been more advocating on the Tendermint side. I just know on the application side, there's some cases where a certain type of evidence will be just handled for specific applications in the sense of like, let's say cross-chain validation or cross-chain collateralization, whatever the name is today.
No, but that's
it's different. Yeah.
matter,
So yeah. And so it's like, I don't recall the reasons outside of the ADR for discussing to push it to the application.
So I think that maybe there was argument about counterfactual slashing as something which is already sort of the context exists at the application level, and maybe we don't have everything we need at the Tendermint level.
No, so so in the ADR I wrote up, which isn't really an ADR, it's just like I guess actually it is, yeah. So there's a few points about the arguments in favor of leaving it in the application. One is that the SDK is already tracking a bunch of information that Tendermint is not, with respect to like validators that are signed, validators that were bonded. Like Tendermint keeps the validator set for every height, but it doesn't per se, if you give it a validator, it can't tell you, if that validator was bonded in the last 3 weeks or whatever, without doing a lot of work looking it up at every height and essentially brute force searching for it, right? So it doesn't really track that. So that would be, it would just be something for Tendermint to track, and it's not that much data. So,
Yeah, but the question is like, so this is something we definitely need. I mean, we could even like ignore this and just do the logic and then submit something which is potentially stale, which is not so clever. But the other option is that you just ask application for this exactly piece of information. Like, is this validator set still bonded, or is this validator still bonded as part of ABCI interaction? So you don't even need to track this, but you ask application, but you adjust application for that piece of information.
Like Tendermint asked the application.
Tendermint asks application about this, and
that's
then
weird.
Okay.
It's just a weird way of using ABCI. I mean, it could be done. Honestly, I don't think that's a really strong reason. Like, it's not that much data, and like Tendermint might as well be able to handle that kind of thing. And I think it actually needs to anyways, to deal with certain other issues at the peer layer. So yeah.
Kind of a minor Tendermint question. Does Tendermint itself keep track of the unbonding period, or is it primarily on the application to like send when it can update or not?
No, so Tendermint has a parameter called max age, evidence max age, which is effectively the unbonding period, except currently it's measured in height.
This is part of the hybrid time.
So there's a whole other set of issues around evidence and time that need to be addressed. Both, how specifically to deal with the hybrid time scenario, and then, dealing with the proposer time thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, what I touched on at the beginning of the call was just like, maybe in the sense of the SDK, like they can stop tracking the validator set and we expose an extra thing over the ABCI to just like feed it the current validator set or something like that. So it's like not duplicated across the application and Tendermint.
Yeah.
But
honestly, I don't think the duplication is a big deal. Like, it's not that much data, I don't think. So compared to like state data and block data, I think it's pretty insignificant. So the deduplication isn't particularly compelling to me yet. The other reasons in here is that, the application is going to have to support cross-chain collateralization and slashing, and so it'll have functionality. So, regardless, it's going to need some of this stuff, but that's, again, not a big one. And then the final one was just like, dealing with DOS concerns, putting it in transactions allows us to engage the fee mechanism of the application. So, but again, so I don't think it's particularly compelling to move all this to the application, especially since, it's going to be necessary for every application, and applications aren't only going to be in Go, and rewriting all this in other languages. And, we want that to happen regardless, but, the more we can do
There's
at once.
one thing we haven't discussed yet, and so it's about the censorship or censorship resistance. So there is also some implicit assumption we make here that all those evidence will be able to pass through and then also be proposed in case of attack on like lines. And some of those validators which executed attack might be still active on the main chain. And so seems that we need to also just be careful there to see if we can really ensure that these correct guys they can make true. And also then for challenge response protocol, it's kind of the same thing, that they need to submit something on time, otherwise they are considered faulty. And so we also need to just check this censorship and how we want to ensure this. So the question is do we want to, what is the risk of not considering this right now? Because it's, again, a complexity and pushing it for later. And then.
Yeah. So, excuse me. I was thinking that because the concern is, if this attack happens, if these attacks happen and the validators, if the attacks happen on the main chain, right, not on the light client, on the main chain, we're just out of luck because, they'll almost certainly censor it. And there's basically nothing we can do on chain, and then we have to defer to a social consensus mechanism. And so the question is, one question is well, if that's the case, and especially with the validator set being dynamic, if they mount such an attack, and then they're no longer part of the validator set, by the time people notice the attack and try to start gathering the evidence against it and the justifications, maybe they could come back into the validator set and then start censoring it. And so, at that point, it starts to bring into question the value of actually doing any of this on chain at all, versus saying, if we see such an attack, is it at that point, do we just go to social consensus to deal with it regardless of whether we think the chain will be able to do it or not? And it seems wrong. It seems like we should be putting as much as possible onto the as much evidence handling as possible in, so that in the cases where we could have done something about it, they don't get away with it. But maybe it's not worth it if the likelihood is that if they do it, that they I don't know.
Because the interoperability theory, we assume that we have up to 2/3 of faulty validators. So just at a border of taking fully over. But if they are still bonded, or they are still able to be bonded, which is the case we are interested in, because otherwise we cannot punish them anyway. Then they can just ignore this, all those stuff we are saying. They will just censor it, and we don't have really, unless we change Tendermint to also to block really the system in case there is evidence there which should be proposed, and it's not being proposed by current proposer. So in this case, we sort of then, the only thing we can do, if you have more than 1/3 of voting power still being correct, they can just block everything. And then
I don't know. I don't think we can do that without compromising liveness in general.
We can do this, but it's just much more complex. And yeah, there is a risk that we introduce a new correctness problem there.
Uh-huh.
But there is sort of a way to do this, that when you see some message, as message is being gossiped by you, you know that it will reach eventually everyone else, you know, and then it should eventually be proposed. So at some point, you just stop, you know, if I saw valid evidence and it hasn't been proposed for a day, then I just stop participating in a network.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is a signal for the whole network that we need to switch to the social consensus.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are in a case which is maybe more I don't know, realistic, or it's hard to talk about realistic casing, but if you have less than 1/3 of, or we need to have a bit more than 1/3, it could be less than 1/3 of active or something like this, then we can still process this on the chain. And so it's in pity that we are not doing this if we can, if we have a mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of weird game theoretical thing, right? Because it's like, if you're going to mount the attack, you should stay in the validator set so that you can prevent censorship, right? But if we don't implement the on-chain mechanism, then you don't have to stay in the validator set because you can just leave and you won't get punished on-chain. Yeah. But not getting punished on-chain is exactly what would happen if you stayed in the validator set. And so it's hard to think about, like, does it even matter? And in these cases, do we just like defer to a, you know, social consensus anyway? You know, but then you start to ask yourself questions like, why do we slash anyone at all in the first place? You know? So I don't always know.
The difference here is that we have a fork.
We have a fork. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So like we can try to turn all those kinds of attacks into the real-time checks.
Yeah.
Then just disincentivize happen during the normal operation. But once we have a fork is a special thing. And so fork in case of Litecoin, although we try to treat it as a special thing, you know, we need to think twice there. Because like it's a fishy decision from the beginning, because the fork is a fork, and so maybe we don't care if it's a Litecoin or not.
Well, it does depend actually, because for the lunatic. The lunatic, I think, only works if you don't actually have if you're not, if it's less than 1/3. So the lunatic we definitely need to punish for, and definitely can, because otherwise it ends up being equivocation or, you know, amnesia or something like that. So those kinds of forks, the lunatic forks, we can definitely punish for and definitely should punish for. But the consensus fork attacks on the light client are much more difficult, as we're seeing, and are maybe not something we should even bother doing on chain, and just it's a good question.
But let's say you detected what could be the alternative if you don't do it on a chain, like light client detected the fork, and then what we do? Like if we how we stop the world, or how we, you know,
you broadcast the thing everywhere. You know, you get it on, you send it to the full nodes. The full node should be gossiping it. Correct full node should like halt. It's like detecting a fork on chain. You know, right now, if you detect a fork on chain, the node panics and it's game over, right? Okay. So, you know, we could have the same behavior. Oh, someone sent me a fork, panic, right? Like obviously we wouldn't do that, but you know, broadcast it on Reddit and Twitter and the forum and wherever.
And so
on the dev call, we'd show it on the dev call here.
But in that case, then
that'd be super delayed
for the 100 people watching it a week later. Yeah.
If 100 people watch this, I'd be surprised.
Yeah. Hi.
But in that case, we would still want to run the whole protocol, but then we do it in sort of this offline mode.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We delegate this to, I don't know, to the ICF or whoever to run a monitor, and then just collect data for a day. And then we don't have, I mean, there are, of course, benefit of this approach, because we need to implement significantly less stuff on Tendermint.
I mean, we still need to more or less implement a lot of the same things. It's just, it won't be integrated into like the Tendermint peer-to-peer full node. So, you know, different set of concerns or whatever, but we still need all the verification and to do like the collection and whatever. So this point, I guess, needs to be written up. Yeah. So I guess some takeaways are the counterfactual issue should be closed and spun out into at least one new issue about detecting and punishing lunatic validators, and that can be a new type of evidence that should be relatively simple, but try to document the issues there. And then we need to write up a discussion around this larger issue around like fork accountability, essentially, and whether to even bother trying to do it on chain, given that it won't be possible in every case. And the game theory maybe suggests that like it doesn't matter whether we do it or not, because we end up in the same kind of scenario.
Because it may be, if you compare it to what we have right now, to some extent, it's a hard fork or equivalent to hard fork business we're doing right now. So it requires social coordination, and then it takes some time to be executed, and then we can think. So if we detect really a fork being pipeline or full node, then we stop the world, we inform everyone, and then we enter this social consensus thing like we do when there is a hard fork. And the only sort of difference there is that now we need to compute or separate correct from faulty, so that we can somehow take this into account for the new state. Because in a new fork, then this should be somehow reflected. So we should, I don't know, punish the bad guys, kick them out, something like this.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense that it seems for me like interesting option, because I think we already have mechanism for doing this for hard fork purpose. And so here it would just be adding this, implementing this small module, which would be significantly simpler to implement as a standalone, essentially web app, to which you just need to upload your evidences, and then you just run it, and say, these are the bad guys. The nice thing about this is that once these vote sets are uploaded, everyone can check this. It's not ICF is doing something or whoever will be monitoring. So it can be done in a fully transparent way, so everyone can check this. So
yeah, cool.
Kind of a side question.
Is Zach around? I'm wondering.
I think he left.
We need to say blockchain 3 times now. Blockchain. Doesn't work.
Kind of a side question, a bit orthogonal, but with like this pipelining increase the probability of a fork happening?
Yeah, I think so. Does it?
What pipelining?
Like hot stuff style?
Yeah, if like Tendermint was pipelined.
Not like a bad fork, but you have, I think you have rollback issues.
And then you would have to have like a watcher, like an overseer.
Normally, it shouldn't be the case, because it's just it's more like internal reconfiguration, like we more or less do right now when we do drums. It's just more complex reconfiguration. But it's not, I mean, it's sort of maybe it opens a bit space for this back to the past attacks, but it doesn't increase, like by definition, the possibility of attacks. You still need to have more than 1/3 of faulty nodes. So this is not changing whether we do.
I was just wondering.
Yeah. By the way, Adi is doing some research on the hot stuff versus Tendermint, and apparently, there are some new insights there. So we'll write this down. It seems very soon. So
how come does he want to join the Tendermint calls, or?
It would be good just to at least add him to the.
He is. I checked today. He's on the invite. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm still working on getting him and Igor into Slack.
Okay.
Okay. Now the whole world knows.
Slack rules the world.
Okay, cool. So I think that was a healthy, productive discussion. I don't know. There's a bunch of other folks on the call. I don't know if you've been following along or if there's any questions or other things.
Adita's here.
Sweet.
Do you want to touch on like some of the evidence stuff that you've been working on for IBC?
Yeah, it's somewhat orthogonal to the discussion that's been happening here. I think the only relevant part was with the fork accountability, like there has to be some way to submit, like if chain A is connected to chain B and chain B has like a fork, there has to be some way to submit proof of that to chain A to freeze the client. So if the node just panics on a fork, I don't see how easy that would be to like submit that evidence.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my only concern regarding IBC.
Yeah. So the evidence actually needs to make it back to the to IBC. And then in that, there it's covered by fees. So whoever submits it, knows that it's valid or pays for the execution for the blockchain.
Yeah, I guess that's also the point of evidence being handled by the application on the SDK. Like, it would probably be for IBC purposes mainly.
But we're talking that's in a cross-chain setting versus a single chain setting. Yeah.
Right.
So the cross-chain setting, obviously, it's going to be handled by the SDK.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Good discussion. Yeah, I guess we can stop recording now and then go back to like being very unprofessional.